The piercing crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Cherry Creek, Nevada, startling Penelope Sullivan from her thoughts as she scrubbed the last of the dinner plates at Thornton's saloon. For 6 grueling months, she had served drinks, cooked meals, and cleaned until her fingers bled, all on the empty promise that her wages would come at the end of her contract, a contract that ended today, June 15, 1876. "Mr. Thornton, I believe we have matters to discuss," Penelope said, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached the rotund saloon owner who was counting the evening's profits at a corner table. Harold Thornton barely glanced up, his fingers continuing to sort coins with practiced efficiency. "What matters would those be, girl? My wages, sir. 6 months' worth, as per our agreement." Penelope stood straight-backed despite her exhaustion, her honey-brown hair escaping its pins after 14 hours of work. Thornton's laugh was more of a bark. "Agreement? I gave you a roof over your head and food in your belly. Most orphans would be grateful." "I'm 22 years old, Mr. Thornton, hardly an orphan in need of charity. We agreed on $15 a month plus room and board. That's $90 you owe me." Her voice remained steady even as her heart pounded against her ribs. The saloon owner finally looked up, his small eyes narrowing. "Listen here. This establishment barely breaks even. I can't be paying out fancy wages to some girl who can't even serve drinks without spilling half of them." "That happened once my first week," Penelope countered, heat rising to her cheeks. "Sir, I need that money. I've worked honestly for it. Consider your room and board as payment in full." Thornton stood, his considerable girth forcing Penelope to step back. "Now, if you want to continue working here, you'll accept those terms. Otherwise, you can pack your things tonight." Outside, the setting sun painted Cherry Creek's main street in hues of gold and crimson, but Penelope saw none of its beauty as she marched back to the kitchen, blinking furiously to keep tears at bay. 6 months of savings gone. Her plans to open a small seamstress shop in a more respectable part of town shattered. Miles Porter had just tied his horse at the hitching post outside Thornton's when he heard the commotion. A tall man with shoulders broadened by years of ranch work, he pushed his hat back on his son's streaked brown hair and frowned. He'd come to town for supplies and perhaps a drink, not to witness what sounded like the beginnings of a proper row. "I don't care what you say, Mr. Thornton. You owe me my wages." A woman's voice, clear and determined despite its obvious distress, carried through the batwing doors. "Lower your voice, you ungrateful wench." Thornton's response was loud enough to draw the attention of several passers-by who slowed their pace, eager for evening entertainment. Miles hesitated only a moment before pushing through the doors. Inside, he found a scene that immediately set his jaw tight. Harold Thornton, a man whose reputation for dishonesty was well known throughout Nevada, towering over a slender young woman whose flushed face was set in determined lines. "Is there a problem here?" Miles asked, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife through butter. Both heads turned toward him. The woman's eyes, a striking hazel that seemed to shift between green and gold in the lamplight, widened slightly. Thornton's face darkened. "This is a private business matter, Porter. Nothing that concerns you." Miles casually removed his leather gloves, tucking them into his belt. When a man refuses to pay honest wages to a lady, it becomes the concern of any gentleman present. He kept his voice mild, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. "She was paid in room and board," Thornton blustered. "More than fair for a girl with no references who showed up half-starved on my doorstep." "Is that so?" Miles looked to the young woman. "Madam." Penelope straightened her shoulders. Mr. Thornton agreed to pay me $15 a month plus room and board. Today marks 6 months, and he refuses to honor our agreement. $90 then, Miles said, his eyes not leaving Thornton's increasingly uncomfortable face. She can't prove anything, Thornton muttered. Ain't no contract. There were witnesses, Penelope said quickly. Mrs. Landry from the general store and Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, were both present when we made our arrangement. Miles nodded thoughtfully, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. The clink of coins seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the saloon. "I'll tell you what, Thornton," he said pleasantly, though his eyes remained hard. "I'll settle the lady's wages. $90. He counted out the coins onto the nearest table with deliberate precision. "And in return, you'll acknowledge receipt of payment in full, in writing, witnessed by everyone in this establishment." Thornton's face flushed an ugly red. "Now see here, Porter, or," Miles continued as if Thornton hadn't spoken, "we can discuss this matter with Sheriff Wilson. I imagine he'd be mighty interested to hear about your peculiar business practices, especially considering the complaints I've heard from the Wilcox brothers and old Jim Bender about similar situations." The saloon had gone completely silent. Even the piano player had stopped mid-tune to watch the confrontation unfold. Thornton looked from Miles to the silent observers around the room, then to the money on the table. With a muttered curse, he snatched a piece of paper from behind the bar, scrawled something on it, and thrust it at Miles. "Take it then, and take her too. Not worth the trouble anyway." Miles slid the $90 across the table. "A pleasure doing business with you, Thornton." He turned to the young woman, whose expression had transformed from despair to astonishment. "Madam, I believe you're free to collect your belongings." Penelope hesitated, then nodded once and hurried to the back room. Miles waited patiently by the door, ignoring Thornton's glares and the curious whispers that had broken out around the saloon. When she returned a few minutes later with a small carpet bag, Miles held the door open for her. As they stepped out into the warm evening air, Penelope turned to him. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Porter, Miles Porter," he tipped his hat. "And no thanks necessary, Miss Sullivan, Penelope Sullivan, Miss Sullivan." His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "May I ask what your plans are now?" Penelope clutched her carpet bag tighter. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I suppose I'll need to find new employment." Miles nodded, glancing down the street thoughtfully. "As it happens, I'm in need of a housekeeper at my ranch. The previous one left to get married last month." He turned back to her. "The position includes room and board plus $20 a month, paid promptly." Penelope stared at him. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you worked 6 months for Harold Thornton without murdering him in his sleep," Miles replied with the ghost of a smile. "That speaks volumes about your character and patience." Despite herself, Penelope laughed, the sound surprising even her after the stress of the confrontation. "That's hardly a recommendation. It's enough for me to offer you a trial period." Miles's expression grew more serious. "My ranch is 15 miles outside of town. The work is honest but demanding. Sunday afternoons would be yours to do with as you please." Penelope considered her options, which were admittedly few. Cherry Creek was a small town with limited employment opportunities for single women. Without references which she doubted Thornton would provide, even those would be difficult to secure. "And if I accept," she said carefully, "what exactly would my duties entail? Cooking for myself and 3 ranch hands, keeping the main house in order, laundry once a week." Miles shrugged. "Nothing you wouldn't expect." Penelope hesitated, studying his face. Miles Porter couldn't be much past 30, with laugh lines around his eyes and a weathered complexion that spoke of long days under the Nevada sun. Unlike many men she'd encountered, his gaze was direct without being improper. "Mr. Porter, while I appreciate your offer and your intervention on my behalf, I feel I should be clear. I won't accept any position that might compromise my reputation." Understanding dawned in Miles's eyes, followed swiftly by something that might have been admiration. "Miss Sullivan, I assure you that your duties would be strictly those of a housekeeper. You would have your own private quarters in the house, separate from the bunkhouse where the men sleep." He hesitated, then added, "My late mother raised me to respect women, Miss Sullivan. I don't aim to disappoint her memory." The mention of his mother seemed to settle something for Penelope. "In that case, Mr. Porter, I accept your offer, for a trial period as you suggested." Miles nodded, his expression lightening. "Well then, Miss Sullivan, I believe we have an agreement." His eyes twinkled slightly as he added, "Though unlike some, I intend to honor mine." As he helped her up onto his horse, Miles smiled down at her. "Now you work for me, Miss Sullivan. I promise you'll find it a far more rewarding arrangement." Penelope couldn't help but notice how the setting sun caught in his brown hair, turning it to burnished copper as they rode away from Cherry Creek, and toward an uncertain future that somehow seemed brighter than it had just an hour before. The Double P Ranch stretched across 500 acres of Nevada grassland, nestled against the foothills of distant mountains. As they approached after nearly 2 hours of riding, Penelope felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The main house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure of weathered wood with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings, including a barn, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a cookhouse, were arranged in a loose semicircle nearby. "It's not much compared to some," Miles said as they approached, "but it's home." "It's beautiful," Penelope replied honestly. After 6 months in a cramped room above Thornton's noisy saloon, the quiet expanse of the ranch seemed almost otherworldly. A lanky young man emerged from the barn as they rode up, his surprised expression quickly masked as he took Penelope's presence in stride. "Evening, boss. Didn't expect you back so soon." His eyes flicked curiously to Penelope, but he maintained a respectful demeanor. "Thomas, this is Miss Sullivan. She'll be taking over as housekeeper." Miles dismounted and reached up to help Penelope down. "Miss Sullivan, this is Thomas Webb, my foreman." Thomas touched the brim of his hat. "Madam." "Mr. Webb," Penelope acknowledged with a slight nod, suddenly conscious of her wrinkled dress and disheveled hair after the long ride. "Thomas, would you mind taking care of Samson? Miss Sullivan and I have had a long day." "Of course, boss." Thomas took the reins of Miles's horse. "Supper's cold, but it's on the stove if you're hungry." "Much obliged." Miles gestured for Penelope to follow him toward the house. As they climbed the porch steps, he paused. "I should warn you, Miss Sullivan, the house has been without a woman's touch for some time. First my mother passed 3 years ago, then Mrs. Donnelly left last month. I'm afraid the men and I haven't been the most diligent housekeepers." Penelope squared her shoulders. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Porter." Miles's lips quirked into a half-smile. "I never thought you were." The interior of the house was spacious, but undeniably in need of attention. Dust had settled on every surface, boots were scattered by the door, and a pile of dirty dishes sat in the kitchen sink. But beneath the disarray, Penelope could see the bones of a lovely home, polished wooden floors, a handsome stone fireplace, and windows that would let in ample light during the day. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right," Miles said, leading her toward a staircase. "It has its own lock, as I promised. The washroom is at the end of the hall. We have running water pumped from the well. It's not fancy, but it's a sight better than most ranches in these parts." The bedroom was simply furnished but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking the rolling grasslands to the east. Someone misses. Donnelly presumably had left a crocheted blanket folded at the foot of the bed, adding a touch of hominess to the otherwise spare room. "I'll leave you to get settled," Miles said, lingering in the doorway. "There's a wash basin and pitcher if you'd like to freshen up. When you're ready, there's food in the kitchen." "Thank you, Mr. Porter, for everything." Penelope set her carpetbag on the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. Miles nodded. "We start early here, Miss Sullivan. Breakfast at 5:30 for the men. I usually eat at 6 before heading out." He hesitated, then added, "I understand this arrangement was unexpected. If you find after a few days that it doesn't suit you, just say the word. I'll see you safely back to town with your wages for whatever time you've worked." The offer, made without obligation or expectation, solidified Penelope's initial impression of Miles Porter as a man of honor. "I appreciate that, Mr. Porter, but I intend to fulfill my commitment. A trial period works both ways, after all." Something like approval flickered in his eyes. "Indeed it does. Good night, Miss Sullivan." After he left, Penelope sank onto the edge of the bed, taking deep breaths to steady herself. The day had begun with her determined to collect her hard-earned wages and perhaps rent a small room in town while she established herself as a seamstress. Instead, she found herself miles from Cherry Creek, employed by a rancher she had known for less than 3 hours. And yet, as she unpacked her meager belongings, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a hairbrush, a few toiletries, and a small sewing kit, Penelope couldn't help but feel that Providence had intervened. Miles Porter might be a stranger, but he had shown more decency in one evening than Harold Thornton had in 6 months. After washing her face and hands and changing into her cleanest dress, Penelope made her way downstairs. The kitchen was empty, though a pot of what smelled like beef stew sat on the cold stove. She found a bowl in one of the cupboards, served herself a portion, and sat at the kitchen table to eat her first meal as an employee of the Double P Ranch. Tomorrow would bring challenges, certainly. But for tonight, with a full stomach and the promise of a safe place to sleep, Penelope allowed herself to hope that perhaps her fortunes had finally begun to change. The rooster's crow woke Penelope well before dawn. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't place the unfamiliar ceiling above her or the distant sounds of men's voices. Then yesterday's events rushed back. Thornton's refusal, Miles Porter's intervention, and her sudden change in circumstances. She dressed quickly in the dim light, pinning her hair into a neat bun before making her way downstairs. The kitchen was empty but showed signs of recent use: coffee grounds spilled by the stove, a half-empty cup abandoned on the table. The ranch hands must have attempted to prepare something for themselves before heading out to their morning chores. Penelope set to work immediately, stoking the stove fire and taking inventory of the pantry. It was well stocked with basics: flour, sugar, coffee, beans, and preserved meats, though lacking in fresh produce. Still, she found enough to prepare a substantial breakfast: flapjacks, bacon, and plenty of strong coffee. By 5:15, the scent of cooking had drawn the first curious visitor to the kitchen. A young man with straw-colored hair poked his head through the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to delight when he spotted the food. "Morning, madam," he said, removing his hat. "Didn't realize you'd be starting so soon." "Good morning," Penelope replied, flipping a flapjack with practiced ease. "Mr. Porter mentioned breakfast should be ready by 5:30. I hope that's correct." "Yes, madam. That's when we usually eat." He hesitated at the threshold. "I'm Daniel Cooper, by the way, one of the hands. Penelope Sullivan." She gestured to the table. "Please sit down. The coffee's ready if you'd like some." Daniel needed no further invitation. Pouring himself a cup and settling at the table with the air of a man trying very hard to remember his manners. Two more ranch hands soon joined him: Jeremy Watts, a taciturn older man with a graying beard, and Thomas Webb, whom Penelope had met briefly the night before. She served them each a plate piled with food, earning murmured thanks and appreciative glances at the first hot breakfast they'd had since Mrs. Donnelly's departure. Miles appeared in the doorway at precisely 5:30, his expression registering mild surprise at the scene of domestic order that had replaced yesterday's chaos. "Good morning, Miss Sullivan. I see you've met the men." "Yes, sir." Penelope set a plate at the head of the table where Miles typically sat, according to the subtle shift in the men's posture. "I hope everything is satisfactory." Miles took his seat, surveying the food with approval. "More than satisfactory, thank you." Breakfast proceeded with the men discussing the day's work: fence repairs in the north pasture, a delivery of hay expected from town, 2 mares close to foaling. Penelope listened while she cooked another batch of flapjacks, building a mental map of the ranch and its operations. "Miss Sullivan," Miles said as the men began to finish, "after you've had your own breakfast, perhaps you could join me for a tour of the property. It might help you get your bearings." "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Porter." The men departed with thanks, leaving their empty plates stacked neatly, a courtesy Penelope suspected was not their usual habit. She quickly ate her own portion, then washed the dishes before joining Miles on the porch where he waited, consulting a small notebook. "Ready?" he asked, tucking the book into his shirt pocket. "Yes, sir." Miles led her first to the barn, a large structure that housed not only the working horses but also several prize breeding stock. "The Double P specializes in quarter horses," he explained as they walked past stalls occupied by magnificent animals. "My father started with just 3 mares and a stallion 20 years ago. Now we're known throughout Nevada and parts of California." Pride resonated in his voice, not boastful but deserved. Penelope noted how the horses responded to his presence, many nickering softly or extending curious noses over their stall doors. "They're beautiful," she said honestly. "They're the future of this ranch." Miles paused by a stall housing a heavily pregnant mare. "This is Duchess. She's carrying our most promising foal sired by our best stallion out of our fastest mare. Should be born any day now." The tour continued to the bunkhouse, which Penelope viewed only from the outside. The cookhouse, used primarily for large gatherings. The smokehouse, the chicken coop, and various other outbuildings. Throughout it all, Miles explained the rhythms of ranch life: early mornings and long days, seasonal work that varied from calving and branding to haymaking and winter preparations. "It's a hard life," he admitted as they walked back toward the main house, "but a good one. The land provides if you're willing to work with it instead of against it." Penelope observed him as he spoke, noting how his face softened when he discussed the ranch. This was clearly more than a business to Miles Porter. It was a legacy, a purpose. "And what are your expectations for my role here?" she asked as they reached the porch. Miles considered the question seriously. "The house needs attention, cleaning, organization, that sort of thing. Meals for myself and the hands, laundry once a week. Beyond that," he shrugged, "Mrs. Donnelly used to keep a kitchen garden. It's gone to weeds now, but you're welcome to revive it if you've a mind to." "I'd like that," Penelope said, already envisioning fresh vegetables to supplement their meals. "And mending. I notice Mr. Webb's shirt has seen better days." Miles's mouth quirked upward. "If you're offering to patch clothes, you'll be the most popular person on this ranch by sundown. The men have been making do with their own clumsy stitching for weeks. Consider it part of my duties, then." Penelope smiled, feeling a small surge of confidence. This was work she understood, work she could take pride in. "One more thing," Miles said as they reached the door. "The men usually handle their own dinner on Sundays so you can have your afternoons free. Town's a fair ride, but Thomas or I can take you in if you wish to attend church services or visit friends." The slight hesitation suggested he wasn't certain she had any connections in Cherry Creek worth maintaining. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. That's very considerate." In truth, Penelope had few acquaintances in town, having spent most of her time working at the saloon. But the prospect of occasional visits to purchase supplies or simply to walk on proper sidewalks was appealing. Well then, Miles glanced toward the north pasture where his men were already at work. "I should join them. If you need anything, just ring the bell by the cookhouse. Someone will hear it." With that, he touched the brim of his hat and strode away, leaving Penelope to contemplate the enormous task of restoring order to the Porter household. She began with the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed, then moved methodically through the downstairs rooms, sweeping, dusting, polishing, and rearranging. By midday, when she paused to prepare a simple lunch of sandwiches for the men to collect at their convenience, the main living areas had already undergone a remarkable transformation. The afternoon was devoted to the more personal spaces Miles's study, which she approached with particular respect, straightening papers and books, but careful not to disturb his organizational system, such as it was. Throughout her work, Penelope couldn't help but notice small details that painted a picture of the ranch's owner. Dog-eared books on horse breeding alongside novels by Mark Twain and Sir Walter Scott, a meticulously maintained ledger showing the ranch's finances, a daguerreotype on his desk of an older couple, his parents, she presumed standing proudly before a much smaller version of the house she now worked in. By the time she needed to begin dinner preparations, Penelope had formed an impression of Miles Porter as a complex man, pragmatic, but with an appreciation for literature. Disciplined in business matters, yet sentimental enough to keep family mementos close at hand. The men returned as the sun began its descent, their appreciation for the house's improved state evident in their surprised expressions and careful wiping of boots before entering. Dinner was a hearty beef stew with dumplings and an apple pie Penelope had managed to assemble from dried apples found in the pantry. "Miss Sullivan," Thomas said as he helped himself to a second serving, "I speak for all of us when I say this is the best meal we've had since Mrs. Donnelly left. Maybe even better, though don't tell her I said so if you ever meet her." The other men murmured agreement, their earlier reserve melting in the face of good food and a clean house. Miles, who had been quieter than the others, finally spoke. "You've accomplished more in one day than I expected in a week, Miss Sullivan. The house hasn't looked this welcoming since my mother was alive." The simple compliment, delivered without flourish, warmed Penelope more than she cared to admit. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. There's still much to be done, but it's a start." Later, after the men had retired to the bunkhouse and Miles to his study, Penelope sat at her bedroom window, looking out at the vast expanse of land now bathed in moonlight. The day's work had left her physically tired but mentally satisfied in a way she hadn't experienced at Thornton's. There, her efforts had never been acknowledged, let alone appreciated. Here, in just one day, she had begun to carve out a place for herself. It wasn't the independent life she had dreamed of, but it was honest work with fair compensation, under the employment of a man who, so far at least, seemed to value her contribution. As she prepared for bed, Penelope reflected that while the circumstances that brought her to the Double P Ranch had been less than ideal, perhaps they had led her exactly where she needed to be. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Penelope found both demanding and satisfying. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and organizing, her afternoons cooking and mending, and her evenings planning the next day's meals. The work was ceaseless but rewarding, especially as the house gradually transformed under her care. Miles, for his part, proved to be a fair employer. He was often absent during daylight hours, supervising ranch operations or occasionally riding into town on business. When present, he was unfailingly polite, but maintained a certain reserve that Penelope found herself both respecting and curious about. Their interactions were primarily practical discussions about supplies needed from town, updates on household improvements, occasional consultations about menus when guests were expected. Yet Penelope couldn't help noticing how his eyes sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, or how he had taken to bringing back small items from town that he thought might please her: fresh lemons for a pie, a new cookbook, seeds for her revived kitchen garden. June gave way to July, and the Nevada summer bore down with relentless heat. Penelope adapted her routine, rising even earlier to complete the heaviest work before the day grew too hot, and preparing lighter meals that wouldn't require long cooking times. One particularly scorching afternoon, she was picking the first ripe tomatoes from her garden when Miles approached, leading a chestnut mare. "Miss Sullivan," he called, "I thought you might like to see the new foal. Duchess delivered last night a fine colt with perfect markings." Penelope straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'd love to. Just let me put these tomatoes in the kitchen." Minutes later, she joined Miles at the barn, where he was waiting patiently with the same mare he'd ridden into Cherry Creek the day they met. "This is Samson," he said, patting the horse's neck. "He's the gentlest mount on the ranch. I thought perhaps you might like to ride instead of walk. The foaling stall is in the north barn." Penelope hesitated. "I've never ridden before, Mr. Porter." Miles looked genuinely surprised. "Never." "Well, that's easily remedied." He extended a hand. "If you'll allow me to assist you." With some trepidation, Penelope placed her hand in his. Miles's grip was firm but gentle as he helped her mount, explaining how to sit and hold the reins. The unexpected proximity, his hands at her waist as he adjusted her position, his voice close to her ear as he offered instructions, created a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "I'll lead him," Miles said, taking Samson's reins and starting toward the distant barn. "But someday soon you should learn to ride properly. It's practically a necessity out here." "I'd like that," Penelope replied, finding that she meant it. Despite her initial nervousness, there was something exhilarating about sitting atop the powerful animal, seeing the ranch from a new perspective. The north barn was cooler than outside, its interior dimly lit and smelling of fresh hay and horses. Miles led her to a large stall where Duchess stood protectively over a gangly foal with a distinctive white blaze down his face. "He was born just after midnight," Miles said, his voice softening with pride. "Thomas stayed with Duchess through the whole thing. Said it was an easy birth, all things considered." Penelope leaned forward slightly on Samson, enchanted by the sight of the newborn colt as he nursed from his mother. "He's beautiful. Have you named him?" "Not yet. I was thinking maybe you'd like to do the honors." The unexpected offer caught Penelope off guard. Naming a valuable foal seemed a responsibility beyond her position as housekeeper. "Are you certain? Surely that privilege should go to you or Thomas. You've become part of the ranch, Miss Sullivan," Miles said simply. "It seems fitting." Something in his tone made Penelope glance down at him. Miles was looking not at the foal but at her, his expression unguarded in a way she'd rarely seen. The moment stretched between them, filled with something unnamed yet undeniably present. "Starlight," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Because of the white mark on his forehead. Like a star." Miles nodded, his gaze still fixed on her face. "Starlight it is." Later that evening, as Penelope prepared dinner, she found herself humming softly a habit her mother had once teased her about, saying it was a sure sign of a heart at ease. The observation gave her pause. Was her heart truly at ease here at the Double P, working for a man she had known for barely a month? The answer, she realized with some surprise, was yes. Despite the hard work and occasional loneliness, Penelope had found a contentment at the ranch that had eluded her during her time in Cherry Creek. The house was beginning to feel like a home, her home, in some small way, and its owner. Penelope's thoughts stalled there, unwilling to examine too closely the growing warmth she felt whenever Miles entered a room. He was her employer, after all, and she his housekeeper. That relationship had clear boundaries, boundaries she had no intention of crossing. And yet, as she served dinner that evening and caught Miles watching her with that same unguarded expression she'd glimpsed in the barn, Penelope couldn't quite silence the small voice wondering if perhaps those boundaries weren't as immutable as she'd believed. August arrived with a heat wave that scorched the grasslands and tested the ranch's water reserves. The men worked shorter days, rising well before dawn to complete essential tasks before the worst of the afternoon sun, then resuming work in the early evening when temperatures began to ease. Penelope adapted her schedule accordingly, having learned from her first summer in Nevada that certain tasks, baking, laundry, heavy cleaning, were best avoided during the hottest hours. Instead, she used those oppressive afternoons to sit in the relative cool of the porch, mending clothes or preparing vegetables from her now flourishing garden. It was during one such afternoon, with the temperature hovering near 100 degrees, that Miles found her shelling peas in the shade of the porch. "Miss Sullivan," he said, removing his hat and wiping his brow with a handkerchief, "I'm riding into town for supplies. Is there anything you need?" Penelope set aside her bowl of peas. "Yes, actually, I've made a list." She retrieved it from her pocket, a neat inventory of kitchen staples and household items. "And if Mr. Peterson at the Mercantile has any lemons, I'd be grateful for a few. With this heat, I thought lemonade might be welcome." "Consider it done." Miles tucked the list into his shirt pocket, then hesitated. "I was wondering. That is, would you care to join me? The buckboard would be more comfortable than riding, and you mentioned wanting some fabric for new curtains." The invitation caught Penelope by surprise. In the 2 months she'd worked at the Double P, she had visited Cherry Creek only twice, once for Sunday services, and once to purchase personal necessities, both times accompanied by Thomas, rather than Miles himself. "I wouldn't want to be a bother," she said, though the prospect of escaping the ranch's confines, even briefly, was appealing. "No bother at all." Miles offered a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Besides, I'd value your opinion on a few items for the house. Mrs. Donnelly always said I had no eye for such things. In that case, I'd be delighted to accompany you." Half an hour later, having changed into her best dress, a modest blue calico that she'd carefully maintained, Penelope found herself seated beside Miles in the ranch's buckboard wagon, heading toward Cherry Creek. The journey passed pleasantly, the slight breeze created by their movement offering some relief from the heat. Miles proved to be an engaging travel companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area's history. It was the longest conversation they'd had that wasn't directly related to household or ranch matters, and Penelope found herself enjoying the chance to see a more relaxed side of her employer. "May I ask you something, Miss Sullivan?" Miles said as they crested a small rise that offered a view of Cherry Creek in the distance. "Of course. How did you come to be working at Thornton's? It seems an unusual place for a young woman of your refinement." Penelope glanced at him, surprised by the personal nature of the question. Miles had never inquired about her past before. She considered deflecting but found herself wanting to answer honestly. "Necessity, primarily. I came west from Boston after my parents died of influenza. My father was a schoolteacher, my mother a seamstress. They left me enough for the journey but little else." She smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her skirt. "I had hoped to establish myself as a seamstress here, but soon discovered that Cherry Creek already had 2 ladies providing such services. Thornton's was hiring, and the promise of room and board along with wages seemed the most practical option at the time." Miles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And now, are you still hoping to establish your own business someday?" The question gave Penelope pause. In the weeks since coming to the Double P, her earlier ambitions had receded somewhat, replaced by more immediate satisfactions: the pleasure of seeing the house restored to order, the gratitude of the men for good meals and mended clothes, the quiet approval in Miles's eyes when she anticipated a need before it was expressed. "Perhaps," she said finally, "though I find my current position fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected." Something like relief flickered across Miles's face. "I'm glad to hear it. The ranch has come alive again since your arrival. The men have noticed it too." Before Penelope could respond to this unexpectedly personal observation, they were entering Cherry Creek's main street, and the moment for such conversation had passed. The town was quiet in the midday heat, though the usual complement of horses stood hitched outside the saloon and general store. Miles helped Penelope down from the buckboard with careful hands, then tied the horses to the hitching post outside Peterson's Mercantile. "Let's start here," he suggested. "We can get most of what we need, then visit the butcher before heading back." As they entered the store, the proprietor looked up from his ledger, his face brightening with recognition. "Miles Porter, twice in 1 month must be some kind of record." "Afternoon, Peterson," Miles replied good-naturedly. "We've come for supplies." He gestured to Penelope. "This is Miss Sullivan, my housekeeper." Mr. Peterson's gaze shifted to Penelope, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Miss Sullivan, of course. I remember you from Thornton's." He gave her a respectful nod. "Pleased to see you found more suitable employment." "Thank you, Mr. Peterson." Penelope was acutely aware of the curious glances from the store's other patrons. Cherry Creek was small enough that her departure from Thornton's and subsequent employment at the Double P had likely been fodder for gossip. Miles seemed to sense her discomfort. "Perhaps you'd like to look at the fabric while I handle the staples, Miss Sullivan." Grateful for the suggestion, Penelope made her way to the back of the store where bolts of fabric were displayed. She was examining a pretty floral print when a familiar voice made her stiffen. "Well, if it isn't Thornton's runaway barmaid." Penelope turned to find Abigail Winters, the banker's wife and one of Cherry Creek's self-appointed arbiters of propriety, regarding her with barely disguised disdain. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Winters," Penelope replied evenly, refusing to be provoked. "I must say, you've landed on your feet rather quickly." Abigail's gaze flicked meaningfully toward Miles, who was engaged in conversation with Mr. Peterson at the front of the store. "Though I wonder if you've simply traded one type of service for another." The implication was unmistakable and deliberately cruel. Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from anger. "Mr. Porter has been a perfect gentleman and a fair employer," she said, keeping her voice low but firm. I would appreciate it if you would refrain from suggesting otherwise. Abigail's thin lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course, my dear. I'm sure your arrangement is entirely proper. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Though you might want to know that people are talking. A single man, a single woman, living under the same roof miles from town. It raises questions. Before Penelope could respond, Miles appeared at her side, his expression pleasant but his eyes hard as they met Abigail's. Mrs. Winters, he said with a slight nod. I trust you're well. Quite well, Mr. Porter. Abigail's demeanor shifted instantly to one of exaggerated cordiality. I was just catching up with Miss Sullivan here. Such a small world, isn't it? Indeed. Miles's tone made it clear he wasn't fooled by her sudden friendliness. If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Winters, Miss Sullivan and I have several errands to complete before we return to the ranch. Without waiting for her response, he turned to Penelope. Have you found what you were looking for? Yes, Penelope said, grateful for the intervention. This floral print would be perfect for the kitchen curtains, and perhaps this blue for the study. Miles examined the fabrics with a seriousness that would have amused her under different circumstances. They look fine to me, but I'll defer to your judgment. Shall we have Peterson cut a few yards of each? As they completed their purchases and left the store, Penelope could feel Abigail Winters's gaze following them, assessing and judging. The encounter had left her unsettled, not for her own sake but for Miles's reputation. She had no illusions about the power of small-town gossip. They completed their remaining errands in relative silence, the easy camaraderie of their earlier conversation dimmed by the shadow of Abigail's insinuations. It wasn't until they were on the road back to the ranch, Cherry Creek receding behind them, that Miles finally spoke. I apologize for Mrs. Winters, he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. She's always had a sharp tongue and a talent for causing discomfort. There's no need for you to apologize, Penelope replied. Her behavior reflects on her, not on you. Miles glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Nevertheless, I regret that your position at the Double P might be causing difficulties. Penelope understood his meaning immediately. Mr. Porter, if you're concerned about my reputation, please don't be. I've learned that people will talk regardless of what one does. What matters to me is the truth of my situation, which is that I am employed honestly by an honorable man. The tension in Miles's shoulders seemed to ease slightly at her words. Thank you for that, Miss Sullivan. Still, perhaps it would be wise if Thomas accompanied you to town in the future, to avoid giving unnecessary ammunition to people like Abigail Winters. The suggestion stung more than Penelope cared to admit. It seemed a retreat, an acknowledgement that there might be some truth to the whispers, but she recognized the practicality of Miles's concern. If you think that best, she said, keeping her voice neutral. Miles looked at her again, longer this time. I don't like it, he admitted. But I won't have your reputation compromised because of your association with me or the ranch. The sincere concern in his voice softened Penelope's disappointment. Then we're agreed. Thomas will be my escort for future town visits. She managed a small smile. Though I must say, he's not nearly as knowledgeable about local history as you are. Miles's answering smile eased the last of the tension between them. Perhaps I can provide a written guide, complete with annotations about which of Peterson's stories are true and which are embellished for the benefit of visitors. The rest of the journey passed in lighter conversation, but Penelope couldn't quite forget Abigail Winters's words or the brief shadow they had cast over what had otherwise been a pleasant day. As the Double P came into view, however, she felt a surge of relief and something close to homecoming. whatever Cherry Creek might whisper about her position here. Penelope knew the truth: this ranch had become more of a home to her in 2 months than any place since her parents' house in Boston. And if her feelings toward its owner were growing more complicated by the day, well, that was a matter she would keep carefully to herself. September brought cooler temperatures and a change in the ranch's rhythms. The men began preparing for winter, repairing buildings, stocking hay, and bringing cattle down from the higher pastures. Miles was often gone from dawn until well after dark, returning to the house exhausted but satisfied with the day's progress. Penelope, too, adjusted her routine. She preserved the last of the garden's bounty, prepared heartier meals to sustain the men through longer workdays, and began making heavier curtains to keep out the approaching winter drafts. The house was fully transformed, now clean, organized, and reflecting her own careful touch in 100 small ways. One evening in late September, as a sudden autumn storm lashed the windows with rain, Penelope sat by the fire in the main room, mending one of Miles's shirts. The house was unusually quiet. The hands had gone into town for supplies and wouldn't return until morning due to the worsening weather. Miles himself had ridden out to check on a section of fence reported damaged, but had promised to return before dark. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 8, Penelope set aside her mending and moved to the window, peering anxiously into the gathering darkness. The storm had intensified over the past hour, rain giving way to hail that rattled against the glass like thrown pebbles. Just as she was considering whether to light a lantern and hang it on the porch as a beacon, she heard the sound of hoofbeats, followed by the thud of boots on the porch steps. The door burst open, admitting a gust of wind and a thoroughly drenched Miles Porter. "Mr. Porter." Penelope hurried to help him with his sodden coat. "You're soaked through. Come near the fire before you catch your death." Miles allowed her to lead him to the hearth, water dripping from his clothes and forming puddles on the polished floor. "Sorry about the mess," he said through chattering teeth. "Storm caught me by surprise, came up faster than I expected." "Never mind the floor," Penelope said briskly. "You need dry clothes and something hot to drink. Wait here." She hurried upstairs to his room, where she quickly gathered clean trousers, a shirt, and a heavy sweater from his dresser. Returning to the main room, she found Miles attempting to remove his boots, his fingers stiff with cold. "Here," she said, kneeling before him without thinking. "Let me help." The simple act of removing his boots, her hands working efficiently at his feet, created an unexpected intimacy that made Penelope acutely aware of their solitude. Miles seemed to feel it too. When she glanced up, his eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her despite the chill in the air. "Thank you," he said softly as she set the second boot aside. "You should change," Penelope said, rising quickly and handing him the dry clothes. "I'll make some coffee and heat up some of the stew from dinner." In the kitchen, Penelope busied herself with practical tasks, trying to ignore the awareness that Miles was changing just on the other side of the door. It was nothing improper. She was simply caring for an employer who'd been caught in a storm, yet the situation felt charged with unspoken possibilities. When she returned to the main room with a tray bearing coffee and a bowl of stew, Miles was seated before the fire in his dry clothes, his wet hair pushed back from his forehead. The flames cast his features in warm light, softening the lines of his face and giving him a younger, more vulnerable appearance. "You're a godsend, Miss Sullivan," he said as she set the tray on a small table beside him. "I don't know what the double P did without you." "Survived quite adequately, I imagine," Penelope replied lightly, though his words pleased her. "Survived, yes, but not thrived." Miles took a sip of coffee, his eyes closing briefly in appreciation. Perfect. Just what I needed. Penelope hesitated, uncertain whether to leave him to his meal or remain. The storm provided a convenient excuse to stay. The howling wind and pounding rain created a cocoon of isolation around the house, separating them from the outside world and its judgments. "May I join you?" she asked finally. "I've some mending to finish, and the light is better here by the fire. Please do." Miles gestured to the chair opposite his. "In fact, I'd welcome the company. It's a wild night to be alone." Penelope retrieved her sewing basket and settled into the indicated chair. For a time, they existed in companionable silence, Miles eating his stew, Penelope working her needle through the fabric of his shirt. The domesticity of the scene was not lost on her. It might have been a tableau of married life rather than employer and employee. "May I ask you something, Miss Sullivan?" Miles said eventually, setting aside his empty bowl. "Of course. Are you happy here?" Truly, the question, coming so unexpectedly, caused Penelope's hands to still. She looked up to find Miles watching her, his expression serious but gentle. "Yes," she answered honestly. "More so than I expected to be. Even with the isolation, the hard work, the limitations," Penelope considered this. "Every situation has its challenges, but yes, even with those things I find contentment here." She hesitated, then added, "The ranch has become a home to me in ways I hadn't anticipated." Something flickered in Miles's eyes, hope perhaps, or relief. "I'm glad to hear that. Very glad." The intensity of his gaze made Penelope's heart quicken. She returned her attention to her sewing, though her fingers trembled slightly. "When I rode into Thornton's that day," Miles continued after a moment, "I was angry on your behalf. The injustice of his refusing to pay honest wages, it offended me, but I never expected." He trailed off, and Penelope looked up again, unable to resist the pull of his unfinished thought. "Never expected what?" Miles rose from his chair and moved to stand before the fire, his back to her. "I never expected that bringing you to the Double P would change everything so fundamentally." The confession hung in the air between them, fraught with implication. Penelope set aside her sewing, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Miles must hear it over the storm's fury. "Changed in what way?" she asked softly. Miles turned then, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the firelight. "In every way that matters. The house feels like a home again. The men are happier, more settled, and I—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I find myself looking forward to returning each evening, knowing you'll be here." The admission, simple yet profound, made Penelope's breath catch. "Mr. Porter Miles," he corrected gently. "After all this time, I think you might call me Miles, at least when we're alone." "Miles," she repeated, the name feeling both foreign and familiar on her tongue. "I don't know what to say." He moved closer, stopping before her chair. "You don't need to say anything. I just wanted you to know that your presence here has been a blessing." He ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture of uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I probably shouldn't have said even that much. It's not appropriate, given our positions." Penelope rose slowly, finding herself standing closer to him than propriety might allow. "Perhaps positions can change," she said, surprised by her own boldness. Miles's eyes widened slightly. "Penelope," he said, her given name sounding like a caress in his voice. "What are you saying?" Before she could respond, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, making them both jump. It was followed immediately by a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark white, before plunging it into darkness as the electricity failed. "Stay here," Miles said, his practical nature reasserting itself. "I'll light the lamps." In the momentary absence of his presence, Penelope pressed her hands to her heated cheeks, wondering at her own daring. Had she truly been about to suggest what, exactly? That their relationship might evolve beyond employer and employee. The very thing Abigail Winters had insinuated with such malice. And yet, as Miles returned with a lit lamp that cast a warm glow over the room, Penelope couldn't regret her words. The months at the Double P had shown her a man of integrity, kindness, and quiet strength, a man she had grown to admire, respect, and if she were honest with herself, love. The storm's directly overhead now, Miles said, setting the lamp on a side table. It should pass within an hour or so. Yes, Penelope agreed. The weather was the furthest thing from her mind. Miles, about what I said, you don't need to explain, he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. The storm, the unusual circumstances. It's an evening for saying things one might not ordinarily say. Disappointment flickered through Penelope. He was offering her a graceful retreat, a way to pretend her words had been nothing more than a product of the dramatic weather and their unusual solitude. "Is that what you believe?" she asked quietly. "That I spoke from the influence of the moment rather than my heart." Miles went very still, the only movement the play of lamplight across his features. "Penelope," he said finally, her name almost a sigh, "I would never presume to interpret your heart. I only meant to offer assurance that nothing need change between us if that's your wish. And if it isn't." The words emerged barely above a whisper, yet they seemed to fill the room. Miles moved toward her then, slowly, deliberately, as if giving her ample opportunity to withdraw or object. When she remained in place, he reached out to take her hand in his. "Then I would tell you that from the moment I watched you stand up to Thornton, refusing to be cheated of what was rightfully yours. I admired your courage," he said, his voice low and earnest. "And that with each day you've spent at the Double P, that admiration has grown alongside deeper feelings I scarcely dared acknowledge, even to myself." The confession, offered with such raw honesty, made Penelope's heart swell. "I came here as your employee," she said, her fingers tightening around his. "But somewhere along the way I began to see the ranch and you as home." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Miles raised his free hand to her cheek, his touch gentle as a breeze. "Penelope Sullivan," he murmured, "would you consider making that arrangement permanent? Not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." Though she had sensed the conversation moving in this direction, the actual proposal still took her breath away. "Miles, are you certain?" "What about the talk in town? Your reputation, let them talk," Miles said firmly. "I care only for the opinions of those who matter, the men who work this ranch, my friends, and most importantly, you." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "I love you, Penelope. I believe I began falling in love with you that very first day, when you stood in Thornton's with your head high, demanding what you were owed." Tears pricked at Penelope's eyes, not of sadness but overwhelming joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "Yes, Miles Porter. Yes, I will be your wife." Miles's smile transformed his face, erasing the last traces of the reserved rancher she had first known. With exquisite care, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss as gentle as a promise and as binding as a vow. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the walls of the ranch house, Penelope Sullivan had found a shelter more enduring than wood and stone. She had found a love strong enough to weather any tempest. The news of Miles Porter's engagement to his housekeeper spread through Cherry Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. Some, like Abigail Winters, received the announcement with thin-lipped disapproval, and knowing glances that suggested the development merely confirmed their suspicions. Others, particularly those who had witnessed Penelope's dignity during her time at Thornton's, or who respected Miles's standing in the community, offered genuine congratulations. For Penelope and Miles, however, the opinions of Cherry Creek's residents were of secondary concern. The more immediate challenge was adjusting to their new relationship while maintaining the ranch's operations. Miles insisted that Penelope no longer perform the heavier household tasks, a change she resisted at first. "I'm perfectly capable of continuing my duties," she argued one morning in early October as they sat together at breakfast. "Our engagement doesn't suddenly render me unable to clean or cook." Miles smiled at her stubborn expression, reaching across the table to take her hand. "It's not a question of capability, my love, but you'll soon have responsibilities as the ranch's mistress that go beyond household chores. I thought perhaps we might hire a girl from town to help with the heavier work." Penelope considered this. As Miles's wife, she would indeed have new duties maintaining the ranch's accounts, representing the double P at social functions, perhaps eventually managing the household staff if the operation continued to grow as Miles hoped. "A compromise, then," she suggested. "I'll continue to cook. The men would revolt if subjected to anyone else's cooking now that they've grown accustomed to mine, but we can hire help for cleaning and laundry." "Agreed," Miles said promptly, bringing her hand to his lips. "Though I insist that you allow me to spoil you occasionally." "It's a husband's prerogative." The casual mention of his future role sent a pleasant warmth through Penelope. "When shall we be married?" she asked, the practical question masking the deeper flutter of anticipation she felt whenever she thought of becoming Miles's wife. "As soon as possible," Miles replied without hesitation. "Unless you want a grand affair that requires months of planning." Penelope shook her head. "I've never dreamed of a large wedding. Something simple, with the people who matter most to us present. That would be perfect." "Then how about the first Sunday in November? That would give us just over a month to prepare. We could hold the ceremony here at the ranch, perhaps in the main room if the weather's poor, or in the garden if it's fine." "November it is," Penelope agreed, her heart light with happiness. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparation. The approaching wedding, combined with the ranch's usual autumn activities, kept everyone busy from dawn until dusk. Miles rode into town and returned with yards of white silk for Penelope's wedding dress, along with a gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. "It's beautiful," Penelope said softly as she examined the ring, a simple band adorned with a small but perfect diamond. "Are you certain you want me to have it?" "My father gave it to my mother when they were married," Miles explained, watching her face with tender eyes. "And his father gave it to his mother before that. It belongs to the woman who shares the Porter name and the Porter legacy." The sentiment behind the gift moved Penelope deeply. She had come to Nevada with nothing but her skills and determination, an orphan without family connections or inheritance. Now she was being offered not just Miles's love, but a place in his family's history, a continuity that stretched backward through generations, and would extend forward into the future they would build together. As November approached, another change occurred that further cemented Penelope's transition from employee to future wife. Miles moved from the master bedroom he had occupied since his parents' passing to a smaller room down the hall, insisting that Penelope take the larger chamber. "It will be our room after we're married," he explained when she protested. "It seems right that you should become accustomed to it now." The master bedroom was spacious and well-appointed, with large windows that looked out over the eastern pastures. The furniture was solid and handsome, a huge four-poster bed, a dresser with an attached mirror, a comfortable reading chair beside the fireplace. but it was the personal touches that truly made the room special. A quilt that Miles's mother had made, family daguerreotypes arranged on the mantel, books that had been read and treasured by generations of Porters. Penelope moved her few possessions into the room with a sense of reverence, aware that she was being entrusted with both physical space and family legacy. Each night as she prepared for bed, she found herself looking at the daguerreotypes, particularly the one of Miles's parents standing proudly before the ranch house, and silently promising to be worthy of the trust they had indirectly placed in her by raising a son who had grown into the man she loved. The first Sunday in November dawned clear and crisp, with just enough warmth in the midday sun to allow for an outdoor ceremony as Miles and Penelope had hoped. The garden, though past its summer glory, had been transformed with ribbons, late-blooming flowers, and carefully arranged bales of hay serving as seating for the modest assembly of guests. In the guest bedroom that had temporarily become her dressing room, Penelope stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing herself in the simple but elegant white silk dress she and Mrs. Peterson from town had created together. Her honey-brown hair was arranged in loose curls, adorned with small white flowers, and her cheeks were flushed with natural color that required no enhancement. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of Thomas, who had been given the honor of escorting Penelope down the makeshift aisle in the absence of family. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his usual taciturn manner softened by evident emotion, "you look beautiful. Mr. Porter is a fortunate man." "Thank you, Thomas," Penelope replied, touched by the sincere compliment from the normally reserved foreman. "I consider myself equally fortunate." Thomas offered his arm with a formality that might have seemed comical in the rough-hewn ranch hand, if not for the genuine respect behind the gesture. "They're ready whenever you are, miss." Penelope took a deep breath, placed her hand on Thomas's arm, and allowed him to lead her from the house to the garden where her future waited. The gathering was small but meaningful, the ranch hands, naturally, along with a few of Miles's friends from neighboring properties, Reverend Clark from the Cherry Creek Church, and even Mr. Peterson from the Mercantile, who had closed his store for the afternoon to attend. Conspicuously absent were the likes of Abigail Winters and others who might have attended out of social obligation or curiosity, rather than genuine goodwill. As Penelope walked toward the simple arch where Miles and Reverend Clark waited, her eyes fixed on the man who would soon be her husband. Miles stood tall and straight in a new black suit, his hair neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaved. But it was his expression that caught and held Penelope's gaze, a look of such open adoration that she felt her heart might burst with answering love. The ceremony itself was brief, but heartfelt. Reverend Clark spoke of marriage as a partnership of equals, each bringing their unique strengths to create something greater than either could achieve alone. When it came time for their vows, Miles took Penelope's hands in his voice steady and clear as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of his life. When Penelope's turn came, she was surprised to find her own voice equally steady, despite the emotion welling in her chest. "I, Penelope Sullivan, take you, Miles Porter, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she said, the words simple yet profound. "I promise to love and cherish you, to support your dreams as you have supported mine, and to build with you a home and a legacy worthy of the Porter name." As Miles slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, Penelope felt the weight of the moment not as a burden but as a blessing, a tangible symbol of belonging and commitment. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Clark proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Porter, you may kiss your bride." Miles cupped Penelope's face with gentle hands, his eyes holding hers for a breathless moment before he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that was both tender and full of promise. The small gathering erupted in cheers and applause, led enthusiastically by Daniel Cooper, who had appointed himself master of ceremonies for the celebration to follow. The wedding feast was served outdoors on long tables decorated with autumn foliage and candles that would be lit as evening approached. The food was abundant and delicious: roast beef, baked potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from Penelope's garden, along with 3 different pies that Mrs. Peterson had contributed as a wedding gift. As the afternoon waned and candles were lit against the gathering dusk, Daniel called for quiet, raising his glass in a toast to the newlyweds. "To Mr. and Mrs. Porter," he said, his young face earnest in the flickering light. "Boss, you found yourself a treasure when you rode into Thornton's that day. And Miss Penelope, Mrs. Porter, I mean you've brought life back to this ranch and happiness to a good man who deserved it. May you have many years and many blessings together." "Hear, hear," echoed the assembled guests, raising their glasses in unison. Miles, seated beside Penelope at the head of the main table, squeezed her hand beneath the tablecloth. "He's right, you know," he murmured for her ears alone. "You are a treasure, and you have brought life back to this place. To me." Penelope leaned against his shoulder, contentment filling her like warm honey. "We've brought life back to each other," she corrected softly, "and we'll build our future together day by day." As darkness fell and the celebration continued around them, Penelope looked out at the ranch that was now truly her home, the solid house with lights glowing in its windows, the outbuildings where the work of their livelihood took place, the pastures stretching into shadow where horses and cattle represented the double Ptks heritage and future. It was a legacy she had never expected to share, yet now it was hers as much as it was Miles's. From an unpaid barmaid to the mistress of one of the region's most respected ranches, it was a journey Penelope could never have predicted that June day when Miles Porter walked into Thornton's saloon and settled a debt that changed both their lives forever. The years that followed confirmed what both Penelope and Miles had already known in their hearts. Their union was not merely one of convenience or practicality, but a true marriage of kindred spirits. The Double P Ranch thrived under their joint stewardship, expanding its operations and reputation throughout Nevada and beyond. Penelope proved to be not just a capable homemaker, but a shrewd business partner. Her organized mind and attention to detail complemented Miles's broader vision and practical knowledge of ranching. Together, they weathered the challenges that inevitably arose: drought years that tested their reserves, economic downturns that threatened their profits, the occasional conflict with neighboring ranchers over water rights or boundary disputes. Through it all, their partnership remained strong, founded on mutual respect and deepening love. The early skepticism from Cherry Creek's more judgmental residents gradually gave way to grudging acceptance and eventually genuine respect as the Porters established themselves as pillars of the community. Even Abigail Winters, that most reluctant of converts, eventually found herself unable to deny the evident success and happiness of the couple she had once disparaged. In the spring of 1878, a year and a half after their wedding, Penelope gave birth to their first child, a son they named James Thomas Porter, honoring both Miles's father and the loyal foreman who had become like family. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Elizabeth Ann, with her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's determined chin. The children grew strong and healthy in the wholesome environment of the ranch, learning the value of hard work and the importance of integrity from parents who modeled both daily. James, from an early age, showed a natural affinity for horses that delighted his father, while Elizabeth displayed an inquiring mind and love of books that reminded Penelope of her own father, the Boston school teacher. By 1886, 10 years after that fateful day at Thornton's, the Double P had grown to include over 1,000 acres, 300 head of cattle, and 50 of the finest quarter horses in the territory. The original ranch house had been expanded to accommodate the growing family and their occasional guests, though it retained the warmth and character that had made it feel like home to Penelope from the beginning. On a golden autumn afternoon much like the one on which they had married, Miles and Penelope sat on the porch swing, watching James, now 8, and Elizabeth, 6, playing a spirited game of tag with Daniel Cooper's children in the front yard. Daniel had married a sweet-natured girl from town 4 years earlier and built a small house on a corner of the Porter property, where he continued to serve as one of the ranch's most valued hands. "They grow so fast," Penelope remarked, leaning comfortably against Miles's shoulder. At 32, she had retained the slim figure of her youth, though childbearing had softened her angles and added a gentle fullness to her curves that Miles found endlessly appealing. "Too fast," Miles agreed, his arm tightening around her shoulders. At 40, he had acquired a few threads of silver in his brown hair and additional lines around his eyes, but remained as vigorous and handsome as the day they met. Before we know it, James will be wanting his own string of horses, and Elizabeth will be heading east for schooling like you've been planning. "Not for many years yet," Penelope assured him, though the thought of their children growing up and away created a bittersweet pang in her heart. "Besides, we may have more little Porters to raise before these two are grown." Miles glanced at her, eyebrows raised in question. Penelope smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat stomach. "Are you certain?" he asked, wonder and joy dawning in his eyes. "Doctor Harrison confirmed it yesterday when I went into town," Penelope said, her own happiness reflected in her voice. "We should welcome our third child around the end of April." Miles gathered her into his arms, mindful of her condition despite the fact that she was barely 2 months along. "Penelope Porter, you continue to make me the happiest man in Nevada territory. And you, Miles Porter, have given me more than I ever dared dream," she replied, turning her face up for his kiss. "A home, a family, a purpose greater than myself." "Not bad for a cowboy who only meant to settle a debt," Miles murmured against her hair, referencing the story they now told their children how Papa had rescued Mama from a dishonest employer and brought her to the Double P, where they had fallen in love amidst the daily work of ranch life. Penelope smiled at the memory. "You settled one debt and created another," she said softly, "one I'll gladly spend a lifetime repaying." As the sun dipped toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson reminiscent of that first evening they had ridden away from Cherry Creek together, Miles and Penelope Porter remained on their porch, surrounded by the sounds of children's laughter and the quiet evidence of a life well built through love, hard work, and unwavering commitment to each other. In the distance, a horse neighed, perhaps Starlight, now a venerable 15 years old and the sire of many of the ranch's finest foals. The sound seemed to bridge past and present, a reminder of beginnings and continuations, of debts paid and promises kept. "I love you, Penelope," Miles said simply, the words no less meaningful for having been said countless times over the years. "And I love you," she replied, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Always." In that moment, as in so many before and so many yet to come, they were not merely rancher and former housekeeper, not only husband and wife, but partners in the truest sense, two souls who had found in each other not just love but home. The third Porter child, born as predicted in late April of 1887, was another boy, Andrew Miles Porter, with his father's steady gaze and his mother's determined spirit. Unlike his older siblings, who had taken to ranch life with natural ease, Andrew showed from an early age a fascination with mechanics and building that hinted at a different path. "He'll be an engineer," Miles predicted proudly when 7-year-old Andrew disassembled and successfully reassembled a clock that had stopped working. "Maybe build those new automobiles everyone's talking about." "Or bridges, or buildings," Penelope added, watching their youngest son with equal pride. "Whatever he chooses, he'll excel." This acceptance of each child's unique gifts and inclinations characterized the Porters' approach to parenting. James, now 15, was already being given increasing responsibility for the ranch's horse breeding program, while 13-year-old Elizabeth divided her time between helping her mother manage the household and devouring every book she could find, particularly those on history and natural science. By 1901, as a new century dawned, the Porter family had witnessed many changes. Cherry Creek had grown from a dusty frontier town to a respectable small city with a proper school, a bank built of brick rather than wood, and even a telephone exchange that connected it to larger communities. The Double P Ranch, now encompassing nearly 2,000 acres, had telephone service as well, though Miles still preferred face-to-face conversations to the impersonal nature of the new technology. James, at 23, had married his childhood sweetheart, the former Mary Wilson, daughter of Cherry Creek's longtime sheriff. They lived in a newly built house a quarter-mile from the main ranch house, where James continued to work alongside his father while developing his own reputation as one of Nevada's premier horse breeders. Elizabeth, true to her early promise, had indeed gone east for education, completing a degree at Wellesley College that would have been impossible for a young woman of her mother's generation. Now 21 and recently returned to Nevada, she was teaching at Cherry Creek School while considering whether to pursue further studies. Andrew, at 14, remained at home, dividing his time between reluctant participation in ranch chores and enthusiastic experimentation with mechanical projects. His latest obsession was the internal combustion engine, inspired by a trip to San Francisco, where he had seen automobiles on the city streets. Through all these changes and developments, Miles and Penelope's partnership had remained the stable center around which the family orbited. Now in their 50s, they had weathered the tests of time with Grace Miles's hair more silver than brown, Penelope's figure softened by the years and childbearing, but their love for each other as evident as it had been on their wedding day. On a crisp October evening in 1901, exactly 25 years after Miles had walked into Thornton's saloon and changed both their lives, the extended Porter family gathered for a celebration. The original ranch hand's Thomas Webb, now the ranch manager rather than merely foreman, and Daniel Cooper, whose oldest son worked alongside him, were present with their families. Dr. and Mrs. Harrison came from town, along with Reverend Clark, now white-haired but still serving Cherry Creek's church, and even Mr. Peterson, long retired from the mercantile but still sharp-witted at 82. The occasion was ostensibly to mark the 25th anniversary of the Double PTK's expansion, to include cattle as well as horses, a diversification that had proven crucial to the ranch's long-term success. But everyone present knew the gathering was really to honor Miles and Penelope's quarter century, together a silver anniversary celebration disguised as a business milestone, to avoid embarrassing the still modest couple. The main house had been decorated for the occasion, with silver ribbons festooning the porch railings and tables set up in the yard to accommodate the substantial gathering. A feast worthy of a wedding had been prepared under Elizabeth's direction, with contributions from every family connected to the ranch. As twilight descended and lanterns were lit around the yard, James Porter rose from his seat, glass in hand, to offer a toast. Tall and broad-shouldered like his father, with the same warm brown eyes and direct gaze, he commanded attention effortlessly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we're gathered here officially to celebrate 25 years since the Double P added cattle to its operations. But if you'll permit me, I'd like to acknowledge the true foundation of this ranch's success." He turned toward his parents, seated together at the head table. "Pa, Ma, 25 years ago, you began building something remarkable, not just a successful ranch, but a true home. Every one of us here has benefited from the example you've set, the values you've lived, and the love you've shared so generously." Penelope felt Miles's hand find hers under the table, his grip tightening with emotion as their eldest son continued. "The story of how you met has been told so often, it's practically ranch legend, Pa riding into Thornton's like some knight of old, settling a debt, and saying those famous words, 'Now you work for me.'" James grinned at the appreciative chuckles from those who had indeed heard the tale many times. What the story doesn't usually mention is how that simple transaction grew into the partnership we all witness daily, a marriage that has weathered every storm and emerged stronger, a love that has only deepened with time. He raised his glass higher. "So here's to Miles and Penelope Porter, 25 years of love, labor, and legacy. May we all be blessed with such a journey." "To Miles and Penelope," echoed the assembled guests, glasses raised in tribute. Miles rose, clearly moved by his son's words. "Thank you, James. And thank you all for being here tonight." He looked down at Penelope, his eyes soft with love accumulated over decades. "I'm not one for long speeches, as you well know. But I will say this. Whatever success the Double P has enjoyed, whatever legacy we may leave, none of it would have been possible without the woman who took a chance on a rancher she barely knew and turned a house into a home." He extended his hand, drawing Penelope to her feet beside him. "To my wife, my partner, my heart thank you for these 25 years. They have been the greatest blessing of my life." Amid renewed applause, Miles surprised everyone, perhaps even himself, by bending to kiss Penelope tenderly. A public display of affection unusual for the typically reserved rancher. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, and the children had retired to their respective rooms or homes, Miles and Penelope stood together on the porch, looking out at the ranch that had been the setting for their shared life. "Did you ever imagine, that day at Thornton's, that we would be standing here 25 years later?" Penelope asked, her head resting comfortably against Miles's shoulder. "Not in my wildest dreams," Miles admitted, his arm secure around her waist. "I only knew I couldn't stand by and watch that scoundrel cheat you." Penelope smiled, remembering the righteous anger in the younger Miles's eyes. "Your sense of justice has always been one of your finest qualities." "It wasn't just justice that day," Miles said thoughtfully. "Though that's what I told myself. There was something about you, standing there with your chin up despite everything, that caught me from the first moment. I didn't know then that it was love beginning, but looking back, I think perhaps it was." "For me as well," Penelope agreed softly. "Though I was too proud to admit it, even to myself. I was determined to be independent, to need no one." Miles chuckled, the sound vibrating pleasantly against her side. You're still independent, my love, and stronger than anyone I know. You just chose to share that strength with me, with our children, with this ranch. As you've shared yours with me, Penelope returned, turning within his embrace to face him. At 57, her honey-brown hair was liberally streaked with silver, and fine lines framed her hazel eyes. But to Miles she remained as beautiful as the young woman who had caught his attention in a dusty saloon all those years ago. 25 years, Miles mused, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with gentle fingers. God willing, we'll have at least that many more together. At least, Penelope agreed, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. After all, we have grandchildren to spoil now, and I suspect more on the way before long. Miles raised an eyebrow. Has Mary said something to you? Not in so many words, Penelope replied with the wisdom of a mother who had borne 3 children of her own. But she's been turning a bit green at the breakfast table lately, and the smell of coffee seems to trouble her. Another generation of Porters, Miles said, wonder and satisfaction mingling in his voice. My parents would be proud to see how their legacy has grown. As would mine, Penelope added, thinking of her schoolteacher father and seamstress mother who had given her the skills and determination that had served her so well in her Western life. Though I doubt they ever imagined their Boston-bred daughter would become a Nevada rancher's wife. The best decision I ever made was settling that debt and bringing you home with me, Miles said, drawing her close again. Even if my motives weren't entirely pure. Penelope laughed softly. What do you mean? Well, Miles confessed, his eyes twinkling in the moonlight. I may have been more interested in seeing justice done than I admitted, but I also thought you were the prettiest woman I'd ever laid eyes on. Bringing you to the Double P seemed like a fine way to get to know you better. Miles Porter, Penelope exclaimed in mock outrage. Are you saying you had designs on me from the beginning? Honorable designs, Miles clarified, grinning. Always honorable. But yes, I think part of me hoped from that first day that you might someday see me as more than an employer. Penelope shook her head, smiling at this revelation about their beginnings. Well, your hopes were realized, sir. Though I must say, when you said now you work for me that day, I never imagined working for you would turn into all of this. She gestured to encompass not just the ranch but the life they had built together. Neither did I, Miles admitted, but I thank God every day that it did. As they stood together in the silver moonlight, surrounded by the quiet evidence of their shared labor and love, Penelope Sullivan Porter reflected on the journey that had brought her from an unpaid barmaid to the beloved matriarch of one of Nevada's most respected families. It had begun with a simple act of justice, a cowboy settling a debt, but had grown into something far richer and more profound than either of them could have imagined on that long-ago summer day. Their love story, born in the wild heart of the American West, had withstood the tests of time, hardship, and change, emerging stronger with each passing year. And as they turned together to enter the house that had witnessed their beginnings as well as their silver anniversary, both knew with absolute certainty that the greatest chapters of their shared story remained not in the past, but in the future still unfolding before them, a future bright with the promise of continued love, expanded family, and enduring legacy. For Penelope and Miles Porter, what had begun as an employer-employee relationship had blossomed into a partnership that defined not just their own lives, but the lives of all who knew them, a testament to the transformative power of love found in unexpected circumstances, and nurtured through years of shared purpose and unwavering commitment. And though neither could have predicted it that day at Thornton's saloon, both now recognized that moment as the first step on a journey that had led them exactly where they were meant to be together. at home on the land they loved, surrounded by the family they had created, their hearts still beating as one after 25 years of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. It was, by any measure, a life well lived, and a love story worthy of the telling, not just for its romantic beginnings, but for its enduring middle and its promise of a beautiful, continuing